All right. I'm Meg Malone from Actful, right outside of Washington, D.C., and I want to acknowledge some of the many colleagues I worked with on this project, Carly Favero, Camelot Marshall, Ruben Vine, and Abby Finnegan, as well as our former intern, Hannah Luca. We've been working on this project so long, she's almost done with her PhD. Shay Taylor L. and Keith and Marnie Joden. The last presentation talked about a standard setting study, and while we conducted a standard setting study, that's a completely different presentation. So I'm really focusing here on test development and really looking at what you need to attend to in developing a test in sign language. And the example here is American Sign Language, but I think a lot of the lessons learned go forward for any other sign language test. So I'm just going to provide a little overview, talk about why we decided to develop this specific test, a little bit about the process in developing the content. I'm going to talk a little bit about production and filming, because with sign language, production and filming are absolutely construct relevant, and if you don't do it properly, forget it, right? A little bit about rating, and then we'll have a little time for discussion. So how many of you have heard of Actful? Great. All right, I'll just give you my usual overview, what we're known for, the Actful Proficiency Guidelines. You might notice that is our beautiful new inverted pyramid. We revised the guidelines a couple years ago, and the new one is much more three-dimensional, and the colors are better. We have an annual convention this year in San Antonio. In 2027, it will be in San Diego. I couldn't be more delighted. We published a journal called Foreign Language Annals, and those of you who work and publish in languages other than English, I encourage you to submit to it. We really focus on languages other than English in this journal. We publish very little in English, about English. And it really makes it a little fairer because, as we know, it's much easier to get a large N size with an English data set than with many other languages. Can you submit in languages other than English? At this point, we can't submit in languages other than English just because of reviewers. We don't have enough reviewers who are sufficiently proficient in reading for that. We also have a little magazine called The Language Educator for practicing teachers, and we work between the two to emphasize what we do in foreign language annals as well as in TLE. And of course, we're known for the Actful OPI. And our vision is an interconnected world where everyone benefits from and values a multicultural and multilingual education. A vision statement is something you work toward, whereas a mission statement is something you do every day. And I would say that we are not there yet in terms of our vision, but this is what we're working toward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our test, which is called the APPLE, which stands for the Actful Assessment of Performance Toward Proficiency in Languages. It is a big mouthful. That's why we just call it the APPLE. And the aim of it is to measure performance and proficiency. We look at learner performance as evidence of a student's emerging proficiency, and we intend for it to provide positive washback to teaching and learning. Our score reports, which I didn't include here for the sake of time, include a description of what your level is, as well as what you need to do to hit the next sub-level. And it's intended for students ages about 7 or 8 through 18, so elementary, middle, and secondary school students. So I'm going to give you a little overview of the APPLE. So in our languages, in our spoken languages, it's an online assessment. It was developed to be a completely online assessment from the beginning, back in 2005. We never had a paper version. And we have 3 modes: interpretive listening and reading, interpersonal listening and speaking, presentational writing. We have a teacher who speaks over and introduces each section to make it, comfortable and accessible to our students. And then we have some bullet points in the background to help orient the student to what they're supposed to be doing. You can take each of the sections separately, and each section takes 30 to 45 minutes. Any guesses on how much all 4 of these components cost, approximately? Heike, any ideas? A lot. $22, 22 US dollars. I know. And we have 3 forms. Form A is for the novice and intermediate, somewhere around CEFR pre-A1 to about A2-ish. Then Form B is for actual intermediate to advanced, so somewhere around CEFR A1 plus A2 through about B1. And then we have a Form E, which is just for our littles, which is novice intermediate about pre-A1 to A2. And it's for grades 3 to 4, our kids about ages 7 to 9. And it's only for interpersonal listening and speaking. And it's available in English, Chinese, French, and Spanish. So that's a little bit about the basic construct of the apple. And these are the languages in which it's available. And ASL makes 12. So why would we develop a sign language apple? Do you all know what the two most, the only languages in US higher education that are growing in the US? Do you know what two languages those are? They're ASL and one other language. Any guesses on what it is? Korean, K-pop. Yes, so those two languages are growing at higher education, and that has a backward effect on secondary schools. There are more and more students who want to learn American Sign Language in secondary school. In addition, we wanted to address equity for underrepresented groups, and we wanted to look at students who are deaf, CODAs or children of deaf adults who are often very fluent in sign language, and of course world language learners who get to high school and decide that they want to take American Sign Language. In addition, have any of you heard of the Seal of Biliteracy in the United States? The Seal of Biliteracy is a stamp or a certification that students can get on their high school diploma that states that they are proficient in two languages. It's available in all 50 US states and territories, and it's usually English plus one other language, although in Hawaii, one of your languages can be Hawaiian. It doesn't have to be English. We find that very charming. So we wanted to make sure that there was a way for students who are proficient in American Sign Language could get this certificate on their diploma. And we also really wanted to work with the ASL community. We actually started this effort I think in 2018, and we had to take a break during the pandemic because there was so much else going on and everyone was attending to so many other things. So we may actually have been working on this longer than Tobias and Olaf, who suggested that he was ahead of us. So the first thing we did was form an advisory committee. And actually getting the advisory committee was very difficult because, of course, during the pandemic, everybody was attending to a lot of different things. And we landed on 6 consultants that included hearing and deaf ASL experts from across the country, including both secondary and university, because we wanted to include advisors who were working in higher education, because that's where we're hoping a lot of our students will use their ASL. And we really wanted to get diverse input on the needs of the intended test taker population. The biggest issue we had, all of our meetings were held on Zoom, right? But our biggest issue was finding quality interpreters, thank you to our interpreter here, because if the interpretation breaks down, the communication can't take place. As Tobias and Olaf alluded to, many users of sign language aren't as proficient in writing, for example, in a common language such as English. So we could really use those meetings to communicate effectively. And the first interpreters we worked with, we no longer work with. We wanted to find interpreters who knew enough about the vocabulary we use in language to communicate it appropriately, right, in meetings, so they weren't always finger spelling things and getting everybody confused. One of the hardest things was deciding how would we refer to the apple, because some interpreters referred to it as the fruit. It's not the fruit, it is a test. Okay, so that was the beginning. So these are our advisory committee members. One of the most interesting things was we didn't know who was deaf and who wasn't, because during these meetings, even hearing members of the advisory committee signed and used an interpreter. And there was one meeting where at the very end, we were wrapping up and one of the committee members just started speaking. And I was like, whoa, right? So this just shows how respectful the committee was to sign language. So one of the considerations we had to have was to make sure that we had enough resources. And the biggest resource we had wasn't actually money. I mean, we couldn't have done it without the money, but the time. For example, a meeting that might take 45 minutes in a spoken language takes longer because we had to wait for the interpretation. And very often we had to recast what we said, because we might, let's say I misspeak, and then the interpreter signs exactly what I say, and then the interlocutor responds to my misspoken question, then you have to redo the whole thing. And it takes about, 50% times more to do this. So time was important, the effort, the funding, and making sure we were working with the right people. Okay, and then the feasibility of test delivery, how we could present the content and record responses in different schools in the US with different bandwidths. And then I talked a little bit about communication. And then we had items in our pool, but we wanted to make sure they are appropriate for sign language users. And then rating or scoring. So deciding on a test form, we decided to focus on the high school, on the secondary form, and not the middle school form, because at this point there isn't a lot of ASL being taught or used in middle schools in the US. And we wanted to brainstorm what the test would look like to be sign language friendly, what the language of instruction would be, how to capture the video, and how to deliver the test. So it was kind of a lot. So we had an iterative item development process, and we had to be really flexible because we were used to just sending things out and having people return the items in a language. You can't do that in writing in ASL because, as we've learned earlier, ASL is not a written language. So a lot of item content had to be glossed or signed and then discussed. With phase one, we did a lot of in-house glossing and recording of content without professional recording. And then for the second part, we did a lot of revisions based on the pilot, and then we selected and developed it for pilot phase two, and we produced it professionally in phase two, which really made it a lot more affordable because our advisory committee in phase one could go back and re-sign something without having to go to a professional production team. So our process, I talked about the advisory committee, our language assessment experts, and our interpreters. One of the most important things we had to do was name the domains. It took us approximately 6 months to a year to name the domains we were going to assess. And we landed on interpersonal interaction, so back and forth between two people, and receptive comprehension. And we did a pilot testing of phase 1 and 2 with iterative item development. So the first phase was about technical feasibility, and we focused on world language learners. In other words, not children of deaf adults or deaf students, because we wanted to figure out with the people who were probably least proficient in recording themselves and familiar with using sign language, what they needed to know in order to respond to a test, right? So our research question was, can these tasks be administered through the online testing platform that we were using, Learnosity? We conducted this in spring of 2023. We had items at each proficiency level, not a full test form. And we worked with 9 world language participants, and we would change things in between the administration. So it might go to 1 or 2 students, and then we found out, oh, this isn't working, let's change the directions. And we tested them over Zoom. We watched each student take the test from start to finish over Zoom. And then we conducted a stimulated recall and an interview. So there were 3 sessions with subject matter experts. And what we found, the biggest issue was technology. A lot of the students, because they weren't working with a teacher, they were trying to, bless them, conduct the test at home on their phone. But this was a good thing because then we could come out and say, this doesn't work, you need to have this kind of bandwidth, so that if we produced it and students came back and said, well, I want to do this on my phone at home, we were like, no, we tried that, it didn't work, right? The video capture with ASL, the lighting, the background, the chair setup, the framing is very important. You want to make sure to get the whole student in the frame and that their hands aren't outside of the frame. And we wanted to see what students did with minimal directions so that we could make it much more clear. It was really interesting. Then in phase 2, we fixed all of this stuff as much as we could, and then we put it into our actual our test administration form, and we wanted to see if students knew what they needed to do, right? And we did this pilot testing in the summer of 2024 with 35 participants, including all 3 world language learners, deaf or deaf users of ASL, and CODAs. And we did get IRB for this, and we had to get kind of double sensitive IRB because we had learners under 18 as well as deaf learners who are in a vulnerable group. So Some of our logistical considerations were how the features affect proficiency levels in specific ways, methods of recording language for item development, the interactive nature of the ASL community. Many of us work in language item construction, and you send items out, they come back, right? Everyone reviews them in their own little pod, and then you find out, you reconcile it. The ASL community likes to work together. They like to have in-person meetings. So we've changed a lot of what we did to have more, I would say, live time Zoom meetings with interpreters where we take notes for them and they just get the work done and we record things. I actually recommend it for other languages if it works. It's what I call the no homework approach to item development. So it all gets done more or less in live time. And again, I cannot say enough how important our interpreters were. We also wanted to make sure that we were getting input from the different communities and to understand the needs of different groups who use ASL. And we really wanted to attend to how we discussed ASL. Like when we were advertising for actors, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, we usually say like, how'd you hear about this? And our contractor who does our recording said, wow, this is a big experience for me. I changed it to learn from here, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was a big deal. So how we talk about this and how we communicate was really important. So production and filming. We had to cast, again, because the interpersonal interaction is a videotaped recording of a same age chat partner. So a person who looks like they're a high school student asking questions of the test taker and the test taker responding and being recorded, as well as a teacher, and then for the receptive communication, that could be an adult. So we had to encourage deaf and hard of hearing actors to apply. We couldn't limit it to deaf and hard of hearing actors because of laws in the United States about hiring. We had to find a filming location. We had to think about a practical, like a real set versus a digital set, and make sure that there weren't too many shadows for filming. In addition, wardrobe is very important in general, but in ASL, it's very important to make sure that you can see the signing appropriately. So this is what our set ended up looking like. It looks a little dark there, but we wanted to make sure there was light coming from behind on the virtual set to light the actor appropriately. We spent a lot of time on lighting. This was our student interlocutor, and lighting her appropriately to make sure that she showed up was very important. She was terrific, very patient. And you can see this is for the receptive communication. The man is being attended to by one of our quality assurance managers, and she's explaining to him like what he needs to do. So we had to use a teleprompter with both English and gloss text options. And in terms of the takes that we decided to have, it was very challenging because in most languages, our team can at least figure out which take to select. But with ASL, it's communicated in a way that we couldn't even know. So we'd have to go like several times. Which take do you like best? And then we'd take notes on each one in case when it came out, they didn't like the take and decided to go with a different one. So we had extensive log notes on all of the takes for post-production. We should do a podcast on this anyway. And in addition, for some of the test, there are English captions, like for the teacher, not for the interpersonal interaction or the content of the test. So we have English captions, and we wanted it to match the pace of signing, which was super challenging, and we did it. We also had to share the videos for review by our ASL committee in a way that was secure, and then we had to work with our distribution partner on the technical aspects. So just getting it up and running was a lot. So rating and scoring, oh, I'm right on time. We conducted a standard setting study. We actually would have had it done ahead of Tobias and Olaf's, but I'm sure it was snow in DC that confused it. So for the standard setting study, one of the issues, of course, is that the ACTFL guidelines in general and the Apple in particular were not well known in the sign language community in the US. So, and we also wanted to expand our group of raters beyond simply our advisory committee, because a lot of our advisory committee are extremely busy. They have other full-time jobs. A lot of them moved on to new positions. And for rating, we needed to make sure that we would have raters who were available. So we saw the standard setting study as kind of a, not just setting the standards, but also a preliminary view into what training raters would look like, right? So that was really interesting. So what we're looking for with rating is we developed some sample ASL tests to represent proficiency levels. And again, a first standard setting study like this, because there were no benchmarks, we had to create the benchmarks. So just setting up the standard setting study took a long time. And we already had established scoring guidelines for the actual levels, but they didn't account for unique ASL features like iconicity and so on. In addition, ASL is very different from a spoken language, and we wanted to make sure that when we conducted the standard setting study, we could start noting these issues for when we started doing rater readiness training so that we would use appropriate vocabulary and so on. So sometimes in the standard setting study, we'd have to say, okay, we need to focus on standard setting, and we'll come back to this vocabulary in a minute. We also managed to come up with some rationales for different levels during the standard setting study. It was pretty successful. It probably took twice as long as any other standard setting study I've ever conducted, and that was fine. We also did it in shorter bursts rather than long days. We did about 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours in each standard setting study, in part because of Zoom fatigue. But Zoom fatigue with ASL is different than Zoom fatigue in a spoken language, because with ASL, it's all visual, right? Imagine staring at a Zoom screen for 8 hours with and you can't hear anything. I know. So we redesigned it to make it to focus on the different levels in each standard setting, in each part of the standard setting study. It was really interesting. We kind of planned ahead, but we also had to be very flexible. You all know I'm very flexible. I don't care if things go wrong. No, that's not true. But I had to be really, not just flexible, but non-rigid to say, okay, this worked really well for this level. Let's try it in the next level and see if it works or not. So our budget also had to be flexible because we wanted to pay people for the time they were spending in the standard setting. So as a result, we have ASL Apple raters, certified raters, who are consistently applying the rater criteria. So we will do a separate presentation on the standard setting when we've recovered. But it really was very interesting, both from a practical level and as a test developer. So one of the things we had to do was provide an introduction to the Apple course, which of course is only available in English and spoken language. So what we're doing now is creating background that includes ASL. To describe the essential elements of the Apple and how they align with ASL. We had the standard setting meeting. And what we're doing right now is identifying our quality assurance advisors, the people who go in and double rate tests and say, this is on, this is off, this is how you need to focus more. Just as an aside, I worked with the Apple in its creation as a consultant with the Center for Applied Linguistics. I wasn't with ACTFL at the time, which was a really helpful perspective to have started with the test as an outsider and then come in and run it as an insider. And then with ASL, to put myself back as the outsider, right? Like, I'm not a user of ASL, I'm not deaf, I'm not a CODA, I'm not a world language learner of ASL. But to really think about how things work. So my team would sometimes get really discouraged and say, like, this is never going to work. And I'd say, look, I was there at the birth of the original Apple. It was a lot of work to imagine this all online 4 skills test for kids that included video chat partners. That was not a thing in 2005. So it's going to be different with ASL as well. Moreover, whenever you introduce a new language, and ACTFL tests in up to 120 languages, there's always a period where you're figuring out how it works with that language. So that perspective was really helpful, and in addition to supporting the ASL community and making this happen, we had to be very supportive internally and be patient with each other and say, yes, this is really hard, but we're going to get it done, right? So what happened? So we developed the ASL certification course. We're working on continuous improvement. In fact, one of my team members right now is working on I don't want to say overhauling the course, but let us say more than tweaking it for the next round of raters. And we just had a meeting with our raters, and we wanted to make sure they'd rated enough tests that it was more holistic rather than I don't like this one thing, because you need to rate a certain amount of tests to know what's going on. So that gets to my last point, which is the test was released in October 2025, and we have already administered 1,200 tests. And we only have 3 raters. Whoops, so we're going to get more. So that's what we learned. So I'm open for questions now.
Sorry, we can only do one question because we ran out of time.
Oh, sorry. Okay, oh, Tobias, who was ahead of me.
Okay, just a quick question. In terms of like test instructions, are they in written English?
There's
a question, like just why I'm asking this question, because we keep on discussing in our group when should test instruction be understood by the learner. Is this A2, B1? We don't know. A1 at least, we are clear, it should be in German. How did you decide?
All test instructions are in ASL by a teacher, a person who says like, I'm Ms. Malone or whatever her name is. They're also voiced aloud in English, and then they're available on the screen. So technically they're kind of available in 2 languages and 3 domains, sign language, spoken English, and written. But the test content, if the construct is understanding sign language, those are not voiced or written. So content that is dependent on understanding sign language is only in sign language, but the directions are available in other ways, which of course makes it very complicated to make everything work together. But it is also, as a linguist, it's super fun, right, to get all this to work together. So, algo más? Okay, we gotta run. Thank you.